By 1970, 5% of Americans were on prescription speed, not street drugs, not back alley deals. These pills came from family doctors, handed out after 3-minute physicals like candy in avocado green kitchens. They were called rainbow pills. Dexedrine, little colorful tablets marketed as wellness, as a woman's solution, as the clean, modern way to stay thin and productive. Millions of suburban mothers quietly speeding through their housework, not knowing the crash was already coming. Heart attacks in 30-year-old women. Dependency epidemics buried in family secrecy. A generation of casualties from what was essentially legalized amphetamine addiction, prescribed with reckless abandon until the government finally stepped in. Imagine a kitchen in suburban America. Avocado green appliances. A woman in bell-bottoms pours a second cup of black coffee, chasing a tiny bright-colored pill. She is not a criminal. She is a mother, a secretary, a teacher, and her doctor just told her this pill will solve everything. The 1970s were the golden age of diet pills, not the underground kind you hide from the police, but the ones proudly displayed on the bathroom shelf next to the aspirin. They came in a rainbow of colors: pastel pinks, chalky whites, cheerful yellows. Doctors handed them out for weight loss, for energy, for the simple crime of being a tired woman in a world that demanded you stay thin, productive, and silent about it. The pharmaceutical industry had found a goldmine, and the medical establishment blessed it. There was no stigma, no warning, just a prescription pad and a promise. The active ingredient was amphetamine, pure pharmaceutical speed. And by 1970, roughly 1 in 20 Americans was taking it. The vast majority were women. They took pills to shrink their appetites during the day, and when sleep became impossible, they took barbiturates at night. It was a chemical trap disguised as self-improvement. The medical journals called it therapy. The women living through it called it hell. Heart palpitations, paranoid episodes, full-blown dependency. And because it was prescribed by a trusted doctor, nobody called it addiction. For years, this epidemic stayed hidden behind lace curtains and polite smiles, until the bodies started piling up, until the government could no longer look away. How did the most trusted institutions in America convince millions of women to swallow speed every single day? And when the crackdown finally came, who paid the price? The answer begins not in a pharmacy, but on a battlefield. 2 decades earlier, with a drug called Benzedrine, and the birth of a chemically enhanced nation. It started with the war, the Second World War, a desperate need to keep soldiers awake and fighting, pushing through exhaustion on nothing but adrenaline and sheer will. That's where amphetamines first proved their lethal usefulness. The American, British, and German militaries all distributed Benzedrine to pilots, tank crews, and infantry. It wasn't a secret. It was strategy. A chemically enhanced soldier didn't sleep. He didn't question orders. He just kept moving. By 1945, millions of servicemen had been introduced to the power of pharmaceutical speed. When the war ended, those same soldiers came home with a quiet familiarity with stimulants. But the pharmaceutical industry didn't see a problem. They saw a market. The same pill that kept a bomber pilot alert over Berlin could now keep a factory worker productive, a truck driver crossing 3 state lines, or a housewife tackling a mountain of chores. And in the booming post-war economy, with new pressures mounting on women to maintain a tidy home and a trim figure, the industry found its perfect customer. The transformation was swift and deliberate. In the 1950s, amphetamines were rebranded. They were no longer a battlefield tool. They were a wellness aid. Smith, Kline, and French, the same company that had produced Benzedrine for the military, now sold a refined version called Dexedrine. Twice as potent, they claimed, with the least amount of side effects. The advertisements were everywhere. In medical journals, in women's magazines. Little white pills promising to lift your mood, sharpen your focus, and most importantly, melt away unwanted pounds. Diet culture was taking its first deadly turn, and it wore a doctor's white coat. And the doctors bought in. Not all of them, but enough. Pharmaceutical salesmen, charming and relentless, dropped off free samples and glossy brochures. They told physicians that prescribing colorful combinations of these pills wasn't just effective, it was good business. A different color for each time of day. A rainbow of appetite suppressants. The brochures were explicit. Never prescribe the same combination twice. It gave patients the illusion of personalized care. And patients, mostly women, walked out of offices feeling seen, validated, handed a little bottle of hope. They were told it was safe. They were told it was modern. They were told their desire to be thin was more important than any small print on the label. By the early 1960s, the word amphetamine had slipped quietly into the medical vocabulary as a cure for obesity, depression, even mild fatigue. The term speed hadn't yet entered the public consciousness. These were simply diet pills. A housewife could pick them up at the pharmacy, drop them into her purse next to the compact mirror, and swallow one with her morning coffee. She wasn't hiding. She was conforming. The pressure to stay thin had become a national obsession, fueled by magazines with names like Cosmopolitan, Vogue, and Ladies' Home Journal, all featuring impossibly slender models on their covers. The ideal woman was a slender silhouette, and amphetamines were the shortcut. But here is the thing about shortcuts. They always come at a cost. The body doesn't distinguish between a battlefield and a breakfast nook. Those pills worked by flooding the brain with dopamine and norepinephrine, the same neurotransmitters that signal alertness and reward. At first, the effects felt miraculous. Weight dropped off. Energy soared. The house sparkled. But within weeks, the brain began to demand more. The standard dose stopped working. Patients doubled their pills, then tripled, sometimes without even telling their doctors. Tolerance built like a slow tide, and before long, the woman who started with one tiny white pill was swallowing a handful of color just to feel normal. And when night came, sleep was impossible. The body was exhausted, but the mind raced, so doctors prescribed barbiturates, powerful sedatives, to knock them out. Phenobarbital, Seconal, Tuinal. The cycle was diabolical. Amphetamines in the morning to function, barbiturates at night to crash. A chemical pendulum that swung so violently it shattered the natural rhythm of rest. Users woke up feeling drugged and depleted, craving more stimulants just to shake off the haze. This was no longer weight loss. This was full-blown chemical dependency, dressed up in the language of wellness. Meanwhile, the diet pill industry exploded into a multi-million-dollar machine. By the mid-1960s, so-called diet doctors were popping up in strip malls across America. These were not specialists. They were general practitioners, sometimes dermatologists or retired surgeons, who saw an opportunity. They set up weight loss clinics with the sole purpose of handing out amphetamine prescriptions. The examination was a joke. Step on a scale. Stick out your tongue. Here is your bottle of pills. Next patient. No blood tests. No questions about heart health or mental state. Just a 3-minute transaction and a colorful sack of speed. One woman, a journalist named Susanna McBee, decided to investigate. She walked into a doctor's office she'd never visited before, filled out a brief form, and submitted to a physical so cursory, she might as well have been buying a loaf of bread. She was handed hundreds of amphetamine pills, bright yellows, deep reds, pale greens. She then repeated the experiment with multiple other doctors and received the same treatment at every single one. Sometimes, the pills were handed to her before she'd even spoken a single word. Her expose, published in a national magazine, was a bombshell. But the system was so entrenched, so profitable, that it barely slowed down. The doctors made money. The drug companies made money. and the women who complained of palpitations, insomnia, and creeping paranoia were dismissed as hysterical. The profitability was staggering. One dispensing diet doctor paid just $71 for 100,000 amphetamine-containing tablets. He then sold them for $12,000. That's a markup of nearly 17,000%. The pharmaceutical companies encouraged this with slick marketing campaigns aimed directly at physicians. They framed the pills as a humane solution to a growing obesity problem. They buried the addiction risks in fine print. The word amphetamine was often absent from the packaging, replaced with softer, more scientific-sounding names. Patients weren't taking speed. They were taking Obitrol, Desoxin, Bifetamine, and they trusted their doctors. Why wouldn't they? By 1970, an estimated 5% of all Americans, roughly 9.7 million people, were taking prescription amphetamines. A full 8% of all prescriptions written were for stimulants. The vast majority of those scripts went to women. The suburban mother nursing a secret habit was not a rare cautionary tale. She was the national norm. Yet the culture treated it as completely acceptable. Tab Cola was marketed as a meal replacement. Weight Watchers expanded from a small gathering in Queens to a nationwide empire. The message was relentless. Thinness was moral virtue, and any tool to achieve it was justified. The illusion began to crack not from within the medical establishment, but from the people living the nightmare. Women who had taken these pills for years started sharing stories that doctors didn't want to hear. A nurse who used amphetamines for 2 decades described nightmares so vivid she couldn't separate them from reality. Transient episodes of psychosis, she called them. When she tried to quit, the withdrawal was so severe she couldn't think who she was, where she lived, what year it was. She sought help from 3 separate psychiatrists. All 3 assured her that amphetamine addiction didn't exist. She was just anxious, they said. Maybe she needed a different pill. There were other warning signs. Emergency rooms were seeing 30-year-old women with heart attack symptoms, their bodies ravaged by years of stimulant abuse. Autopsies revealed cardiovascular damage in patients with no prior history of heart disease. The nervous system was equally vulnerable. Chronic users displayed symptoms indistinguishable from paranoid schizophrenia, auditory hallucinations, delusions of persecution, uncontrollable rage. In a society that already dismissed women's health complaints, these symptoms were often labeled emotional instability or female hysteria. The root cause, the little colored pills in the medicine cabinet, remained invisible. It took a series of tragic, highly public incidents to finally force a reckoning. Overdoses that couldn't be ignored, death certificates that listed amphetamine poisoning in black ink, and behind each headline, a family that had watched a mother, a daughter, a sister slowly disappear into a psychological and physical abyss. The stories were heartbreakingly similar. She started taking diet pills in her 20s. She needed them to function. She couldn't sleep without sleeping pills. She went to multiple doctors for refills. One day, her heart simply stopped. Or she drove off a road in a confused daze. Or she swallowed 1 too many barbiturates trying to escape the endless, jittery wakefulness. The government, which had turned a blind eye for years, finally began to stir. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act, signed by President Richard Nixon, was the first serious step toward regulation. It created a scheduling system to classify drugs based on their medical use and potential for abuse. Amphetamines were thrust into the spotlight. After decades of being treated as benign weight loss aids, they were about to be reclassified as what they truly were: highly addictive substances with limited legitimate medical purpose. But the transition was not smooth. The pharmaceutical industry fought back. Diet doctors scrambled to protect their cash flow. And millions of women, already physically and psychologically dependent, faced the terrifying prospect of losing their supply. A black market began to form. Prescription forgeries spiked. Desperation set in. In mid-1971, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs made a bold, unprecedented move. All amphetamine products were shifted to Schedule II, the most restrictive category for drugs that still had some accepted medical use. This meant no more automatic refills, no more casual prescriptions. Doctors and pharmacists had to keep strict records. Every single pill had to be accounted for. The implications were enormous. The era of the Rainbow Pill Diet Clinic was effectively over. But the question remained: what would happen to the millions of women already trapped in the cycle? The government had acted, but the damage was done. The system that created the epidemic was not built overnight, and it would not be dismantled by a single signature. The women whose bodies and minds had been sacrificed to a corporate profit machine were left largely on their own, abandoned to navigate withdrawal, stigma, and a medical community that still stubbornly refused to name their suffering as addiction. And in the shadows, the very same pharmaceutical industry that had fueled the crisis was already searching for the next generation of magic pills. A new drug combination was being tested, one that would eventually explode onto the scene in the 1990s and claim its own legion of victims. Its name would be fen-phen. That, however, is the final act of this tragedy. First, we have to go deeper into the world the rainbow pills created. The ordinary women whose lives were quietly destroyed, the doctors who knowingly profited, and the one single decision that would finally force the nation to look itself in the mirror. The real story is about to begin. The real story begins not in a courtroom or a government hearing, but in a split-level house in the middle of a cul-de-sac. It's 7 in the morning. A woman named Carol. And notice I say Carol because that's as good a name as any. It could be Nancy, Barbara, Linda, or your own grandmother. Carol is standing in her kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter with white knuckles. She's been awake for 36 hours. Her heart feels like someone is flicking a light switch inside her chest. She hasn't eaten in 2 days, not a single bite of solid food, because the pills took her appetite and buried it somewhere she can't reach. The house is spotless. The laundry is folded. Her children have been fed, dressed, and sent to school without a single moment of maternal warmth, because there's no warmth left. Only a brittle, humming energy that feels like a radio stuck between stations. Carol is 32 years old, and she is dying. She doesn't know it yet. Her doctor, a kind man with a crowded waiting room and a prescription pad worn thin at the edges, told her that Obitrol was perfectly safe. "It's just appetite control," he said. "You'll feel a little pep. That's all." That was 20 months ago. The bottles multiplied. The colors changed. Dexedrine in the morning, a yellow capsule at noon, a small white pill before dinner, and the barbiturates at bedtime, a blue oval that brought sleep like a heavy curtain dropping, a sleep so deep it didn't feel like rest but like a temporary death. This was the secret life of millions of women. They weren't criminals. They weren't deviants. They were following medical advice. And when that advice nearly killed them, they were told they were imagining things. The 1971 scheduling change was supposed to save them, but for Carol and hundreds of thousands like her, the damage was already done. The pills were still in the cabinet. The doctors had fresh loopholes. And the drug companies, those enormous, faceless corporations, were already scrambling not to save lives, but to salvage their bottom line. Let's look at what happened when the first wave of regulation crashed against the fortress of American medicine. The Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs moved amphetamines to Schedule II in the summer of 1971. No refills. Strict record keeping. Doctors panicked. Some immediately stopped prescribing, cutting off patients who had been chemically dependent for years. The withdrawal hit like a freight train. Women who tried to quit cold turkey found themselves plunged into a hellscape of depression, fatigue, and uncontrollable cravings. Their brains had been rewired. Dopamine receptors, flooded for so long, had downregulated so severely that ordinary pleasures, a kind word, a good meal, The smile of a child, registered as nothing. Blank space. The world lost all color. Carol's withdrawal began on a Monday. She decided to stop on her own, because she'd read a newspaper article about amphetamine abuse and felt a flutter of terror. By Wednesday, she couldn't get out of bed. Her muscles ached as if she'd been beaten. Her mind raced with fragmented thoughts that shattered before they could form coherent sentences. By Friday, she was hallucinating. She saw insects on the walls. She heard whispers from the empty hallway. Her husband, bewildered and frightened, called the doctor. The doctor prescribed a mild sedative and suggested she just needed rest. No one used the word addiction. No one even hinted that the pills she'd been swallowing for nearly 2 years were the cause of her disintegration. They said she was overworked, anxious, perhaps menopausal. Carol was 32. Her story is not unique. It is the story of an era when medical schools taught that amphetamines were safe for short-term weight loss, and pharmaceutical sales reps reinforced that message with glossy brochures and free golf trips. A doctor who expressed concern about addiction risk could be ostracized by his peers. His referrals would dry up, and the local drug company rep would stop bringing lunch to the office. The financial incentives were enormous, and human nature being what it is, doctors, not all, but many, chose the path of least resistance. Write the script, collect the fee, next patient. Meanwhile, the women who couldn't quit faced a terrifying void. Some turned to the black market, forged prescriptions, pharmacy break-ins, back alley deals with truck drivers who had their own steady supply. Speed, which had been a respectable pharmaceutical product, suddenly became a street drug for the suburban middle class. And the quality of street amphetamines was unpredictable. Pills cut with rat poison, strychnine, or who knows what. Emergency rooms saw a sharp rise in overdoses. But because the original gateway was a doctor's prescription, the stigma didn't attach to the medical establishment. It attached to the women. They were pill poppers, junkies, bad mothers. The very institutions that hooked them now washed their hands of the mess. But there was a deeper, more insidious pivot happening behind closed doors in corporate boardrooms. The pharmaceutical companies understood the regulatory wind was shifting. They also understood that the market for weight loss was not going away. If anything, the societal pressure on women to be thin was intensifying. Twiggy had arrived, the British model with the waif-like figure, redefining beauty standards to an almost skeletal ideal. Magazines sold the dream. Doctors sold the means. So the companies did what they'd always done. They innovated. If amphetamines were now too hot to handle, they would create a new class of drugs that acted on the appetite center of the brain without the stigma of the amphetamine label. Enter fenfluramine. In 1973, just 2 years after the amphetamine crackdown, the FDA approved this new compound. It wasn't technically an amphetamine, though its chemical structure wasn't a million miles away. It worked by increasing serotonin levels in the brain, promoting a feeling of fullness. The marketers, battle-hardened from years of pushing amphetamines, knew exactly how to position it. Fenfluramine, they said, was a safe, modern, non-addictive alternative. No jitters, no euphoria, no high, just a gentle assistance to the willpower-deficient woman. And the name they gave it, Pondamine, sounded soft and harmless, almost like a pond. Doctors, still licking their wounds from the Schedule II crackdown, were cautious but curious. The drug reps assured them that fenfluramine was a completely different animal. It didn't produce dependence. It didn't cause psychosis. It didn't elevate heart rate the way amphetamines did. It was perfect. And so the prescriptions began to trickle, then flow. Fenfluramine was rarely given alone. Doctors, in their infinite creative wisdom, started combining it with a small dose of phentermine, a stimulant that was technically an appetite suppressant but remained in a lower scheduling category when used in combination. The combination became known as fen-phen. It wasn't FDA approved as a combined therapy. It was an off-label concoction, cooked up in the exam rooms of well-meaning but dangerously optimistic physicians. The results were, at first, spectacular. In the 1980s and early 90s, fen-phen swept the nation. Weight loss clinics that had pivoted away from amphetamines now reopened under new names, offering the fen-phen cocktail as the miracle cure. The marketing was relentless. Lose weight without feeling hungry, without the shakes, without addiction. The same promises, the same eager customers, the same blind faith in white-coated authority. And just like before, the women who swallowed the pills felt a rush of hope. They lost 15, 20, 30 pounds. They bought smaller dresses. They received compliments. They felt, for the first time in years, that they were winning the war against their own bodies. Carol, the woman on the cul-de-sac, was among them. She survived her withdrawal from amphetamines, barely. A year of brutal recovery that left her marriage strained, her children distant, and her sense of self shattered. But by the late 80s, the weight had crept back. The depression never fully lifted. And when her new doctor, a kind young man who'd never known the bad old days, suggested fen-phen, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She took the prescription and drove straight to the pharmacy. She didn't ask about side effects. She didn't read the fine print. She wanted to believe. She needed to believe. The pattern repeated with chilling precision. For a few years, fen-phen worked. Carol lost weight. Her energy returned, though not in the same manic amphetamine way. She felt normal. But then the reports started trickling in. Strange, murmuring heart sounds. Echocardiograms revealing thickened, leaky heart valves. Young women, some in their 30s and 40s, presenting with symptoms of congestive heart failure. The common denominator was fen-phen. The drug that was supposed to be safe, the drug that was supposed to be different, was causing valvular heart disease in a significant percentage of users. The FDA, slow once again, finally issued a public health advisory in 1997. Fen-phen was yanked from the market. Carol heard the news on the radio while driving home from work. She pulled over to the side of the road and sat in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel, just as they had gripped the kitchen counter 20 years earlier. She felt a familiar flutter in her chest. She had been feeling it for months now, a little skip, a thud, a shortness of breath when climbing stairs. She'd blamed it on age, on stress, on not exercising enough. She never once blamed the pills. Because the pills were doctor-recommended. The pills were the answer, not the problem. That had been the mantra of her entire adult life. And now, the radio voice was telling her that the answer had been poison all along. She made an appointment with a cardiologist. The echocardiogram showed mild regurgitation in her mitral valve. Not severe enough for surgery, the doctor said, but concerning. We'll monitor it. No one said the words irreversible damage. No one had to. Carol understood, with the dull clarity of a lifelong consumer of medical promises, that she had been betrayed again. Not by a street dealer or a shadowy figure in an alley, but by a system that had failed every single checkpoint along the way. Here is the pivot that reframes everything you thought you knew about this story. The amphetamine epidemic of the 1970s didn't end. It adapted. It mutated like a virus, finding new chemical pathways to reach the same wallets. The same companies that profited from Dexedrine and Obitrol were either acquired by bigger conglomerates or pivoted to other weight loss drugs. The same marketing playbooks were dusted off and repackaged for each new generation. The same magazines that sold thin as moral virtue still sit at grocery store checkout lines today. And the same doctors, though better educated about addiction, still face a relentless pressure to prescribe, to fix the unfixable, to offer a pill for a problem that is deeply cultural, psychological, and social. So when we talk about the 1970s diet pill crisis, we are not talking about ancient history. We are talking about the direct ancestor of every weight loss scandal that followed. The Fen-Phen disaster killed hundreds and injured tens of thousands. The lawsuits against the manufacturer, American Home Products, totaled into the billions. But that didn't stop the cycle. After Fen-Phen came ephedra, then Meridia, then Belviq, then Qsymia, and now the GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic and Wegovy. Each new drug promised to be the holy grail, effective without the deadly baggage. Each new drug was greeted with desperate hope by a public scarred by the previous failure. And each new drug, in time, revealed its own hidden costs. But we must return to the women, because at the heart of this 40-year pharmaceutical saga is not a molecule. It is a human being. A woman standing in her kitchen at 7 in the morning, swallowing a pill that might make her thin today and might kill her tomorrow, weighing the trade-off and finding it, against all reason, acceptable. Why? Because the world told her, in 1,000 subtle and unsubtle ways, that her value was tied to the number on a scale. Because the person who handed her the pill wore a white coat and spoke in calm, confident tones. Because the alternative, living in a body that society deemed unacceptable, felt like a fate worse than any side effect on a tiny folded insert. Carol's story didn't end with the Fen-Phen recall. She became an activist of sorts, not in the traditional sense, but in the living room sense. She started talking to her friends, her neighbors, her daughters. She told them the truth about what she'd been through, and she discovered, with a mixture of sadness and fury, that nearly every woman over 40 had a similar story. A mother who took Dexedrine in the 60s, an aunt who had a nervous breakdown that was actually an amphetamine psychosis, a sister swallowed by Fen-Phen, a cousin on Meridia. The silence that had protected the industry for decades was beginning to crack, not in the halls of Congress, but in kitchens and coffee shops across America. One of the women Carol met was a retired nurse named Evelyn. Evelyn had been addicted to amphetamines for 20 years, from 1962 to 1982. She'd been prescribed them originally for weight loss after her second pregnancy. She described the experience with a clarity that only comes from surviving the worst. "The pills gave me energy, and then they took it back with interest," she said. "I couldn't think who I was. I didn't know where I lived. I had nightmares so bad. I was afraid to sleep, but I also couldn't stay awake without the pills." She visited 3 separate psychiatrists in the 70s. Every single one told her that amphetamine addiction didn't exist. One suggested she was simply depressed and offered her a tricyclic antidepressant. Another told her to cut back on coffee. The medical establishment's denial was not an accident. It was a feature of the system. The same pharmaceutical companies that manufactured the pills also funded the medical journals, sponsored the conferences, and provided the educational materials that shaped doctor training. They had every incentive to blur the line between therapeutic use and dependency. And when patients like Evelyn presented with textbook withdrawal symptoms, crushing fatigue, anhedonia, psychotic breaks, the diagnostic manual had no code for prescribed amphetamine dependence. So the doctors, many of them sincere but misinformed, categorized these women as neurotic, hysterical, or simply fat and unhappy. But there were a few brave voices. A psychiatrist named Charles O'Brien at the Veterans Administration Medical Center in Philadelphia started speaking out. He'd treated numerous patients, both veterans and civilians, who'd become dependent on prescription amphetamines. He saw the same pattern over and over. A woman prescribed pills for weight loss, a gradual escalation, a secretive double doctoring, a catastrophic crash. He called it iatrogenic addiction, addiction created by the physician. The phrase itself was an indictment, and the medical community didn't want to hear it. O'Brien faced pushback from colleagues who insisted that amphetamine dependence was a character flaw, not a pharmacological inevitability. But he kept treating patients, and he kept documenting their stories. His work, along with that of a few other renegade clinicians, slowly built a body of evidence that could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, the legal system began to stir. The first major lawsuits against diet pill manufacturers and prescribing clinics were filed in the late 1970s and early 80s. Women who had suffered heart damage, strokes, and permanent psychiatric injury began to seek justice. But the legal battle was David versus Goliath. The pharmaceutical companies had teams of high-priced lawyers. They presented studies, some of which they'd funded, that showed no causal link. They settled cases quietly, with non-disclosure agreements that bought silence. The women who took the settlements were sworn to secrecy, their stories erased from the public record. The epidemic, in many ways, was buried twice, once by the doctors and once by the legal machine. Yet, a flicker of resistance remained. Grassroots organizations began to form. Women like Evelyn and Carol, connected through word of mouth, through local support groups, through the nascent women's health movement that was beginning to question the entire edifice of patriarchal medicine. The same energy that demanded natural childbirth questioned unnecessary hysterectomies and fought for breast cancer research funding began to turn its attention to diet pills. They asked difficult questions. Why are only women targeted for these weight loss drugs? Why is thinness considered a medical necessity when the drugs themselves are so dangerous? Who profits from our insecurity? The answers, when they came, were staggering. The diet industry, broadly defined, was worth tens of billions of dollars. The pharmaceutical segment alone was a gold mine. The marketing campaigns preyed on the most vulnerable moments in a woman's life: postpartum, menopause, divorce, the quiet desperation of middle age. And the complicity extended beyond the doctor's office. It reached into the grocery store, where diet sodas and low-fat snacks promised deliverance. It flowed through the television set, where sitcoms laughed at the fat neighbor. It echoed in the family dinner table, where a mother's weight was considered an open topic for comment and critique. The tragedy is that amid all this noise, the real dangers were invisible. The pills that were supposed to save women were quietly destroying them. And when the destruction became undeniable, the same system that created the demand simply moved on to the next miracle cure. The 1990s saw the full explosion of fen-phen mania. The drug combination was not just popular, it was a cultural phenomenon. Over 18 million prescriptions were written in 1996 alone. Diet centers with names like Nutrisystem started offering fen-phen weight loss programs. Doctors who had barely looked at a cardiology textbook were suddenly prescribing a drug that was later found to cause potentially fatal heart valve damage in up to 30% of users. The FDA, understaffed and underfunded, relied on post-market surveillance, meaning they would wait for bodies to pile up before acting. By the time they pulled fen-phen in September 1997, thousands of people had already been permanently injured. The lawsuits that followed dwarfed anything the industry had seen before. American Home Products, the maker of Pondamine and Redux, set aside over $13 billion for settlements. Tens of thousands of claims were filed. The discovery process unearthed damning internal memos showing that the company had known about the heart valve risks for years. They had buried the data, manipulated the studies, and continued to market the drug aggressively. Sound familiar? It was the same playbook that had been used for amphetamines in the 60s, for tobacco in the 50s, for many of the deadliest products ever sold to the American public. The only difference was the decade and the chemical name. But here is the part that rarely makes it into the official histories. While the lawsuits ground on, and the press covered the mounting toll, the same women who had been harmed were left to navigate their injuries alone. Carol's mild regurgitation never went away. Every year, her cardiologist would listen, frown slightly, and schedule another echo. The anxiety of that annual checkup became its own burden. Evelyn, the retired nurse, suffered from chronic fatigue and a heart arrhythmia that limited her daily activities. Neither woman ever received a cent from a settlement. They weren't in the class action, they didn't have the documentation. Their original doctors had long since retired or died. And the cycle continues. Open any social media app today, and you'll see a new generation of diet drugs promoted with the same language of empowerment and safety. The faces change, but the script remains the same. The real story of the 1970s diet pills is not a closed chapter. It's an ongoing tragedy with recurring themes: corporate greed, medical complicity, female suffering, and the stubborn persistence of a culture that values women's bodies over their lives. We're going to pause here, but we're not done. Because, in the final act, we'll trace how the ghosts of Dexedrine and Fen-Phin haunt our present moment. We'll see how the same doctors who once prescribed amphetamines eventually faced a reckoning of sorts, and how the FDA's failure to protect the public led to the very system that now brings us Ozempic and Wegovy, drugs that are being injected by the millions before their full long-term consequences are understood. The pattern is not just repeating, it's accelerating. And the women standing in their kitchens this morning, swallowing or injecting the latest miracle, are walking the same tightrope Carol walked. The question is, will they fall too? They will fall. They are falling. This morning in an apartment in a city you could name, a 22-year-old is injecting herself with a drug that costs more than her rent. She's been told it's a breakthrough, a revolution, the end of obesity. Her doctor, a well-meaning general practitioner who saw a pharmaceutical rep's presentation over a free lunch, wrote the prescription without once mentioning the words long-term safety data. The young woman feels the needle sting, feels the nausea that will last for days, feels the pounds melting away, and she tells herself it's worth it. She doesn't know about Carol. She doesn't know about Evelyn. She doesn't know that the script she's following was written in 1962 and has been performed, with different actors and different chemical names, every single decade since. The question isn't will she fall. It's what happens when she does, and who will be there to catch her, and whether the system that pushed her off the cliff will even acknowledge the bodies at the bottom. Let's go back to the moment when the full scale of the Fen-Phen disaster became undeniable. It's July 8, 1997. The Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, releases a report documenting 24 cases of unusual heart valve disease in women, all with a history of taking the Fen-Phen combination, all with no prior cardiac problems. The valves looked as if they'd been encased in a waxy plaque, thickened and retracted, leaking blood backward with every beat. The cardiologists who examined the tissue samples had never seen anything quite like it. They published the findings in the New England Journal of Medicine. The news hit like a shockwave. But here is the thing. American Home Products, the company that made Pondimin and Redux, already knew. Internal documents later unearthed in litigation showed that as early as 1995, 2 full years before the Mayo report, the company's own researchers had flagged an increased incidence of valvular abnormalities in patients taking the drug. They buried the data. They argued internally about whether to conduct a follow-up study, then decided against it because the results might harm sales. Sales that were, by then, exceeding $300 million a year. The math was cold and simple. The projected profits outweighed the projected liability. A human life, valued actuarially, cost less than a blockbuster drug. The FDA, to its credit, acted with uncharacteristic speed once the Mayo report hit. On September 15, 1997, just 9 weeks later, the agency requested a voluntary withdrawal of fenfluramine and dexfenfluramine from the market. But voluntary is a generous word. The company fought for weeks, insisting the drugs were safe, demanding more studies, threatening legal action. In the end, they pulled them because the public relations nightmare was unsustainable. But the damage was done. An estimated 6 million Americans had taken Fen. Tens of thousands would develop heart valve disease. The class action settlement, when it came, was the largest in history at the time, $3.75 billion initially, later ballooning to over $13 billion. But that money was a cold comfort to the families who had already buried their dead. And now, the revelation that changes everything you thought you knew. The fen-phen crisis didn't end the weight loss drug industry. It perfected it. The lawsuits taught the pharmaceutical companies valuable lessons about how to limit liability, how to structure clinical trials to hide long-term risks, how to market directly to consumers through television ads that featured happy, thin women running through fields of wildflowers without a single mention of side effects. The 1997 FDA Modernization Act, passed in the same year as the recall, loosened restrictions on direct-to-consumer advertising. The result was an explosion of television ads for prescription drugs, and weight loss medications led the charge. The message shifted from "ask your doctor" to "demand this drug," and millions of women did exactly that. The next wave came in the early 2000s with the rise of ephedra-based supplements, an over-the-counter loophole that bypassed the FDA entirely until a young baseball player named Steve Beckler died of heatstroke in 2003, and the public finally demanded regulation. Then came Meridia, which was withdrawn in 2010 after a study showed a 16% increase in cardiovascular events. Then came Belviq, yanked in 2020 after a 5-year safety trial found an increased risk of cancer. Each time, the same sequence played out. A new drug with a new mechanism, an aggressive marketing campaign, a rush of prescriptions, a few years of booming sales, then a slow trickle of adverse event reports, a belated FDA investigation, a tearful press conference, a withdrawal, and a wave of lawsuits that settled for pennies on the dollar of actual harm. The pattern is so consistent, so predictable that you could set your watch by it. And yet, every time a new drug appears, the public memory resets. The lessons of the past are buried under a mountain of well-funded optimism. The women who were harmed are forgotten or dismissed as unlucky outliers, or blamed for their own suffering because they should have known better. The drug companies know this. They count on it. It is the fundamental asymmetry of the pharmaceutical marketplace. The profits are immediate and private. The harms are delayed and diffuse. By the time the bodies are counted, the executives who made the decisions have retired on golden parachutes, and the company has already moved on to the next blockbuster. Carol understood this asymmetry in her bones. After her fen-phen diagnosis, she started collecting stories, not as a journalist, but as a survivor. She would sit in hospital waiting rooms, echocardiogram labs, and cardiac rehab centers, and she would listen. The women she met were from every economic bracket, every race, every region. But their stories had a haunting sameness. They had been prescribed diet pills in their 20s or 30s. They had been told the drugs were safe. They had felt their hearts flutter and their moods darken, and they had been told it was nothing, just stress, just anxiety, maybe a touch of the change of life. And then one day, they couldn't climb a flight of stairs without gasping for air. One day, they felt a crushing weight in their chests. One day, they collapsed. She met a woman named Patricia in a cardiac support group in Dallas. Patricia had been a flight attendant in the 1960s, a glamorous job that came with relentless pressure to maintain a certain weight. The airline mandated it. If she gained 5 pounds, she was grounded. Her company doctor prescribed Dexedrine without a second thought. She took it for 12 years. She quit in 1974 when the crackdown came, but by then her heart was already damaged. She developed a persistent arrhythmia, then cardiomyopathy, and eventually needed a pacemaker at 51. She never sued. She never told her children the full story. She was ashamed. It was supposed to be medicine, she said. How do you explain to your kids that medicine nearly killed you? Carol also connected with a younger generation. Women in their 30s who had taken Meridia or Belviq, or, increasingly, the new GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic and Wegovy. She saw the same hope in their eyes that she had once felt, the same desperate belief that this time, this pill, This injection would be different. And she saw the same early warning signs: the racing heart, the unexplained fatigue, the digestive disturbances that doctors dismissed as minor side effects. She tried to warn them. Some listened. Many didn't. Because the cultural machine that sells thinness as salvation is so much louder than one woman's voice. This is where it gets even bigger. The diet pill crisis was never just about weight. It was about control. It was about a society that pathologized the female body, that constructed an impossible ideal and then sold the tools to chase it, that profited from women's insecurity and then blamed them for being insecure. The same decades that saw the rise of amphetamine diet pills also saw the explosion of Valium, the so-called mother's little helper, prescribed to millions of housewives for anxiety that was, in many cases, a rational response to an oppressive domestic situation. The same doctors who handed out Dexedrine for weight loss handed out Librium for nerves, prescribing uppers and downers to the same patients, creating a chemically managed female population that was calm, thin, productive, and utterly dependent. The 1960s and 70s women's health movement began to name this pattern. Barbara Seaman's 1969 book, The Doctor's Case Against the Pill, exposed the dangers of oral contraceptives and galvanized a generation to question medical authority. Activists like Helen Rodriguez Trias and Billie Avery connected the dots between pharmaceutical marketing, medical paternalism, and the broader structures of sexism and racism. They argued that women were being used as a vast, uncontrolled experiment, that their bodies were the testing ground for drugs that would never be prescribed to men in the same way. And the data confirmed it. Women were prescribed psychotropic drugs at twice the rate of men, diet drugs at more than 10 times the rate. Industry wasn't just profiting from women's health, it was defining women's health in a way that served industry. The backlash against this activism was swift and brutal. The pharmaceutical companies funded educational campaigns that depicted feminists as hysterical radicals who were scaring women away from life-saving treatments. Medical journals ran editorials defending the safety and efficacy of amphetamine weight loss drugs, often written by doctors who were paid consultants for the manufacturers. The FDA, caught between public pressure and industry lobbying, lurched from one crisis to the next, always a step behind, always reacting rather than preventing. It was a system designed to privilege commerce over safety, and it worked precisely as designed. By the late 1990s, a new element entered the equation: the Internet. For the first time, women harmed by diet drugs could find each other without waiting for a support group or a newsletter. Online forums and early social media platforms became gathering places for survivors. They shared stories, compared symptoms, organized legal strategies, and most importantly, broke the silence that had protected the industry for decades. The Fen-Phen litigation was fueled in part by these online communities, which allowed thousands of plaintiffs to coordinate their claims and share evidence. The Internet democratized information in a way that terrified the drug companies. They could no longer count on secrecy and isolation to contain the damage, and yet the machine adapted. Pharmaceutical companies invested heavily in online marketing, in paying social media influencers, in sponsoring patient advocacy groups that would advocate for faster drug approvals and wider insurance coverage. The language of empowerment was co-opted. The new weight loss drugs were marketed not as a concession to societal pressure, but as a feminist choice. You are taking control of your body, your health, your destiny. The same message repackaged. The same underlying dynamic polished with a progressive sheen. The medical establishment, too, evolved its rhetoric. The concept of obesity as a chronic disease gained traction in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. On its face, this was a compassionate reframing, destigmatizing weight and recognizing the complex biological and environmental factors that contribute to it. But it also opened the door to lifelong pharmaceutical treatment. If obesity is a disease, then drugs are medicine, not vanity. Insurers were pressured to cover them. Doctors were encouraged to prescribe them. The market expanded exponentially, and the long-term safety data, the one thing that might have given pause, remained stubbornly absent for the newest drugs. The clinical trials lasted a year or two, not the decades it would take to detect the kind of damage that had slowly accumulated in Carol's heart valves. One of the most damning revelations to emerge from the Fen-Phen litigation was the sheer scale of the data manipulation. The company had not just buried studies, they had actively designed studies to avoid finding harm. They excluded patients with pre-existing conditions, even though those were precisely the patients most likely to be prescribed the drug in the real world. They used statistical techniques to minimize the appearance of adverse events. They terminated follow-up periods before long-term effects could manifest. They cherry-picked endpoints. This was not rogue behavior by a single bad actor. It was standard industry practice, taught in business schools and refined over decades. The companies that emerged from the wreckage of Fen-Phen didn't repent. They perfected. And so we arrive at the present moment. The GLP-1 agonists, Ozempic and Wegovy, and Mounjaro and Zepbound, are being injected by millions of people, many of them women, many of them young, many of them taking the drugs for weight loss rather than the diabetes they were initially approved to treat. The early results are dramatic. Weight loss of 15, 20, even 30% of body mass. A revolution, the headlines scream. A miracle. But the whispers have already started. Reports of severe gastroparesis, a condition where the stomach stops emptying, leaving patients unable to eat, vomiting undigested food hours later, requiring hospitalization and sometimes surgery. Cases of pancreatitis, some fatal. Thyroid tumors seen in animal studies, with human cases beginning to trickle into the medical literature. The drug labels carry warnings about all of these, but the warnings are written in the smallest font, buried deep in the package inserts that no patient ever reads. The question is not whether these drugs will cause harm. They already have. The question is whether the harm will remain rare, manageable, a footnote to a success story, or whether it will blossom into the next Fen-Phen, the next amphetamine epidemic, the next generation of women who trusted their doctors and were betrayed by a system that values their bodies over their lives. Evelyn, the retired nurse who lived through the amphetamine years, followed the news about Ozempic with a sense of dread. She was 84 years old, her heart still skipping beats from the damage done 5 decades earlier. She saw the young women on TikTok dancing with their injection pens, celebrating their weight loss, and she wanted to grab them by the shoulders and shake them. "Don't you understand?" she wanted to say. "I was you. I took the pills. I lost the weight. And I've spent the rest of my life paying for it." But she knew they wouldn't listen. She wouldn't have listened at their age. The promise is too seductive, the cultural reward too immediate. The future is an abstraction until it becomes an emergency. Carol, too, watched the resurgence with a heavy heart. She had become an unlikely archivist of diet drug horror stories, her home office filled with manila folders and legal documents, her computer bookmarked to dozens of medical journals and FDA adverse event databases. She had given testimony at hearings, spoken to journalists, written letters to the editor. She had done everything she could to sound the alarm. And yet the cycle spun on. The money kept flowing. The prescriptions kept climbing. The women kept falling. But there was one thing Carol noticed that gave her a sliver of hope. The conversation was changing, slowly, in the margins. A new generation of doctors, many of them women, were questioning the weight-centric model of health. They were advocating for a health at every size approach, focusing on behaviors rather than BMI, challenging the assumption that thinness is a prerequisite for wellness. They were reading the history of amphetamine diet pills and Fen-Phen and recognizing the same dangerous patterns in the current enthusiasm for GLP-1s. They were speaking out, even when it cost them professionally. And they were being joined, unexpectedly, by some of the very patients who had been harmed. The internet which had been used to market the drugs, was also being used to organize the resistance. A Reddit community called Ozempic Side Effects had tens of thousands of members sharing stories of permanent stomach damage, of relationships ruined by the psychological effects of extreme calorie restriction, of the terrifying weight regain that happened when they stopped the drug. The narratives were raw and unfiltered. They contradicted the polished success stories that filled the pharmaceutical company websites and the celebrity Instagram posts. They revealed the dark underbelly of the miracle. And then, in a quiet development that barely made the news, a small number of lawsuits were filed. Women who had taken GLP-1 drugs and suffered severe gastroparesis were suing the manufacturers, alleging failure to warn, negligent testing, a reckless rush to market. The drug companies denied everything, as they always do. The legal machinery ground into motion. The pattern was repeating, right on schedule. The only difference was that this time, the women who filed the lawsuits had access to the full history of what came before. They could cite the Dexedrine crisis, the Fen-Phen disaster, the Meridia withdrawal. They could argue, with documentary evidence that the industry knew or should have known, that long-term safety data was essential before marketing a drug to millions of otherwise healthy people. Whether they will win is an open question. Whether the damages will deter future misconduct is doubtful. Whether the cycle will ever truly break is a matter of deep, existential uncertainty. But one thing is absolutely clear. The story of 1970's diet pills is not a cautionary tale from a bygone era. It is the prequel to a present-day tragedy that is still unfolding, frame by frame, prescription by prescription by prescription, injection by injection. The final act of this documentary will take us into the heart of the reckoning, the moment when the government finally said enough, the moment the lawsuits peaked, the moment the women stood up and demanded to be heard. It is a story of courage and betrayal, of justice delayed and denied, of the impossible choices faced by ordinary people trapped in a system they did not create. And it ends with a question that each of us must answer for ourselves. What have we learned, and what will we do differently, now that we know the truth? The evidence is in. The witnesses are ready. The verdict awaits. The reckoning arrived not with a bang, but with a piece of paper, a signature on a legal pad, a gavel falling softly on a wooden bench. The 1971 scheduling of amphetamines was the first crack in the dam. But the real flood came later, when the women who had been harmed finally found their way into courtrooms across America. They came with their medical records, their pharmacy receipts, the pill bottles they'd saved as evidence. They came with stories that made hardened lawyers weep. And they came demanding something that had never been granted to them before: accountability. Let's start with the crackdown itself. In the summer of 1971, when the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs moved amphetamines to Schedule II, the immediate effect was chaos. Millions of patients who had been taking these pills for years, some for decades, were abruptly cut off. Doctors, terrified of losing their licenses or facing criminal charges, refused to write new prescriptions. Pharmacists, suddenly required to maintain strict records and report suspicious patterns, started refusing to fill scripts that looked unusual. The supply chain that had pumped amphetamines into the bloodstream of suburban America was severed overnight. The withdrawal was catastrophic. Emergency rooms filled with women experiencing acute psychiatric episodes, hallucinations, paranoid delusions, suicidal ideation. General practitioners who had never seen amphetamine withdrawal didn't know how to treat it. Psychiatric hospitals admitted patients who were diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, conditions that miraculously resolved when the amphetamines finally cleared their systems, sometimes weeks later. The medical establishment, caught flat-footed, scrambled to develop protocols for a condition it had spent decades insisting did not exist. But here is the part of the story that rarely gets told. The crackdown also created a massive black market. Mexican pharmacies near the border began doing a booming business, selling amphetamines over the counter to American tourists who drove down for the day. Forged prescription pads became a valuable commodity on the street. Truck stops, which had long been hubs for the informal distribution of stimulants to long-haul drivers, expanded their operations to include a new clientele, suburban women who could no longer get their pills from the family doctor. The war on drugs, which Richard Nixon had declared in 1971, was supposed to target heroin and marijuana. Instead, it pushed millions of law-abiding women into the arms of illegal drug markets. The women who couldn't access the black market faced a different kind of hell. Cold turkey withdrawal from high-dose amphetamines is not lethal in the way that alcohol or barbiturate withdrawal can be, but it is psychologically devastating. The brain, accustomed to a constant flood of dopamine, suddenly finds itself in a desert. The result is a profound anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure. Food loses all taste. Music becomes noise. The faces of loved ones register as meaningless arrangements of features. Many women described it as a kind of living death, a state in which the world turned gray and flat and silent. Some didn't survive, not because the withdrawal killed them directly, but because the despair drove them to suicide. The medical literature of the era barely acknowledged the suffering. A few brave researchers, like Dr. Charles O'Brien in Philadelphia, published case studies and pushed for formal recognition of amphetamine dependence, but the broader profession remained in denial. The American Medical Association, which had for decades accepted advertising revenue from amphetamine manufacturers, was slow to issue guidelines. The FDA, which had approved these drugs for weight loss in the first place, was reluctant to admit the scale of its mistake. And the pharmaceutical companies, which had made billions, had no incentive to fund research into the harms they had caused. The women were on their own, and in that isolation they began to do something remarkable. They began to organize. The first amphetamine-related lawsuit was filed in 1972 by a woman who had developed cardiomyopathy after years of prescribed dextrin. Her case was dismissed. The next dozen cases met similar fates. Judges ruled that the doctors who prescribed the pills were following standard medical practice, that the pharmaceutical companies had provided adequate warnings, that the women themselves bore responsibility for taking more than the recommended dose. The legal system, built on principles of individual responsibility and caveat emptor, struggled to comprehend a harm that was systemic, diffuse, and created by the very institutions meant to protect public health. But the women kept trying. They found lawyers willing to take their cases on contingency. They found expert witnesses, cardiologists, toxicologists, psychiatrists, willing to testify that amphetamines caused real, measurable, permanent damage. They found each other, sharing medical records and legal strategies and, most importantly, emotional support. By the late 1970s, a small but determined network of plaintiffs and advocates had formed. They called themselves support groups, consciousness-raising circles, health collectives. They were part of a broader movement of patients demanding accountability from the medical industrial complex. The breakthrough came in the early 1980s, when a class action lawsuit against several amphetamine manufacturers was certified in federal court. The plaintiffs were thousands of women who had taken the drugs for weight loss and suffered cardiovascular or psychiatric harm. The discovery process unearthed documents that the companies had fought to keep hidden, internal memos acknowledging addiction risk, marketing plans that deliberately targeted women's insecurities, studies that were buried because they showed dangerous side effects. The same playbook that would later be exposed in the tobacco litigation was laid bare for the first time. The cases settled, most of them anyway. The settlements were large by the standards of the time, tens of millions of dollars, but they were a fraction of the profits the companies had earned. The women who had lost their health, their careers, their marriages, received checks that barely covered their medical expenses. The non-disclosure agreements they signed ensured that their stories would remain private, sealed in court archives, inaccessible to journalists and public health researchers. The silence that had enabled the epidemic was, in many ways, preserved by the very legal process meant to provide justice. And yet, the truth leaked out. A few women violated their NDAs, speaking to reporters or testifying before congressional committees. A few documents were unsealed by persistent journalists. A few researchers gained access to the settlement data and published analyses in medical journals. The picture that emerged was damning. The amphetamine diet pill industry had known, or should have known, that its products were addictive and dangerous. It had marketed them anyway. It had lied to doctors and patients. It had profited from the resulting harm. And when the harm became undeniable, it had used the legal system to contain the damage and prevent systemic reform. The same sequence played out, almost frame for frame, with fen-phen. In 1999, American Home Products settled the first wave of lawsuits for $3.75 billion. Over the following years, the total settlement fund grew to over $13 billion, making it one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements in history. The internal documents uncovered in discovery were devastating. A memo dated 1995, 2 years before the recall, warned that fenfluramine might cause serious cardiac valvular abnormalities. The company's response was not to warn doctors or patients. It was to commission a study designed to disprove the link. When the study results came back ambiguous, the company buried them and continued marketing the drug. The women who died from fen-phen-related heart valve disease were mostly in their 40s and 50s. They left behind children, spouses, careers, communities. The settlement fund established a matrix for compensating victims based on the severity of their injuries and their age. But the matrix was cold and actuarial. It valued a 50-year-old woman's life less than a 30-year-old's. It required applicants to submit echocardiogram results, medical records, proof of prescription history, documents that many women, years after the fact, could not produce. The process was adversarial and exhausting. Many eligible claimants simply gave up. And now, the final surprising detail. In the aftermath of the fen-phen litigation, an internal review at the FDA identified a critical failure in the drug approval process. Fenfluramine had been approved in 1973 based on clinical trials that lasted just 12 weeks. The combination with phentermine, the fen-phen cocktail that caused most of the harm, had never been formally studied or approved. It was an off-label creation, cooked up by individual doctors and spread through word of mouth and medical conferences. The FDA had no authority to regulate off-label prescribing, a loophole that the pharmaceutical companies had exploited for decades. And despite multiple attempts to close this loophole, it remains open to this day. This is the part of the story that should keep you awake at night. The same regulatory gap that allowed amphetamines to be prescribed for weight loss in the 1960s, that allowed fen-phen to spread like wildfire in the 1990s, that allowed Meridia and Belvic to enter the market with inadequate safety data, is the gap through which the current generation of weight loss drugs is flowing. The GLP-1 agonists were approved for diabetes. Their use for weight loss, though now formally approved for some formulations, began as an off-label phenomenon driven by celebrity endorsements, social media buzz, and aggressive marketing by telehealth companies that made obtaining a prescription as easy as filling out an online form. The women who inject Ozempic or Wegovy today are participating in a vast, uncontrolled experiment. The clinical trials lasted a few years. The real-world use may continue for decades. The long-term risks are unknown because they are unknowable at this stage. The history of weight loss drugs suggests, with grim consistency, that significant harms will emerge in time. The only questions are, what will they be? How many people will be affected? And will the system that allowed this to happen be held accountable before or after the bodies are counted? Carol, who had lived through the amphetamine years and the fen-phen aftermath, had no illusions about the answers. She watched the rise of the new drugs with a kind of weary resignation. She was in her 70s now, her heart valve condition stable but permanent, her energy diminished, her faith in institutions long since exhausted. She still spoke to whoever would listen. Local women's groups, nursing students, the occasional journalist who stumbled across the old lawsuits and wanted to understand. She told her story without self-pity, as a matter of historical record. "This happened," she said. "This happened to me. This happened to millions of us. It should not happen again." Evelyn, the retired nurse, died in 2021 at the age of 88. Her heart, damaged by 2 decades of amphetamines, finally gave out. In her last years, she wrote a memoir that her children helped her self-publish. It sold a few hundred copies, mostly to friends and family. But a digital version found its way onto internet forums where survivors of diet drug injuries gathered. Her words, her precise clinical descriptions of withdrawal and recovery, became a touchstone for a new generation trying to understand what had happened to them. She had wanted to be heard, and in the end, she was heard, just not in the way she had imagined. Patricia, the former flight attendant, lived long enough to see the fen-phen recall and the early lawsuits against the GLP-1 manufacturers. Her pacemaker kept her alive, but her quality of life was severely compromised. She died of heart failure in 2019 at the age of 76. Her children, who had never fully understood why their mother was so sick for so long, only learned the full story when they found a box of medical records and legal documents in her closet after her death. She had never told them. She was still ashamed. These women were not statistics. They were not case studies. They were human beings who trusted a system that betrayed them. Their stories, and the stories of the millions they represent, are the true legacy of the diet pill era. Not the corporate profits, not the regulatory reforms, not the legal settlements. The legacy is the lives altered and ended, the families fractured, the decades of silent suffering that followed a prescription written in 3 minutes for a condition that didn't require the drug at all. And what of the doctors? The men in white coats who handed out the prescriptions, who collected their fees, who waved away the complaints of palpitations and paranoia. Some of them faced consequences. A few lost their medical licenses. A few were sued personally. A few, in retirement, expressed regret in interviews or letters to medical journals. But the vast majority continued their careers, untroubled by the devastation they had enabled. They were, after all, practicing within the standard of care. They were following the guidelines. They were listening to the pharmaceutical reps. They were doing what everyone else was doing. The systemic nature of the harm made individual accountability nearly impossible. The doctor who prescribed the pills was not the researcher who buried the study, who was not the executive who approved the marketing campaign, who was not the regulator who failed to act. The chain of causation was so diffuse, so distributed across institutions and decades, that no single person could be held responsible. This is the fundamental defense of the pharmaceutical industry, and it has worked for over half a century. But accountability is not the same as justice. The women who survived the amphetamine epidemic and the fen-phen disaster did not get justice, not in any meaningful sense. They got settlements that compensated a fraction of their losses. They got NDAs that silenced their stories. They got official acknowledgments, years too late, that the drugs had been dangerous all along. They got empathy, sometimes from the journalists and researchers who studied their plight, but they did not get the one thing that might have made a difference, a systemic restructuring that would prevent the next generation from suffering the same fate. The FDA, to its limited credit, has made some reforms in the past 2 decades. Post-market surveillance has improved, though it remains severely underfunded. The agency can now require post-approval safety studies, though drug companies routinely negotiate extensions or fail to complete them. The advisory committee process, which reviews new drug applications, is more transparent than it was in the 1970s, though committee members with financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry are still permitted to vote on approvals under certain circumstances. The pace of reform has been incremental, cautious, and perpetually outpaced by the industry's ability to innovate new products and new marketing strategies. The fundamental problem remains unchanged. The pharmaceutical industry is a profit-maximizing enterprise. Its obligation to shareholders is written into corporate law. Patient safety is a constraint, not a goal. The FDA, the only institution with the power to enforce that constraint, is underfunded, understaffed, and subject to intense political pressure from both Congress and the White House. The laws that govern drug approval and marketing were written by legislators who received campaign contributions from the very companies they were supposed to regulate. The system is not broken, it is working as designed. And the design prioritizes profit over people. So, what do we do with this knowledge? Carol asked this question in every talk she gave, every interview she granted. She didn't have an easy answer. She was not a policy wonk or a legal strategist. She was a survivor who had spent her adult life paying for a decision made when she was 28 years old. But she had a suggestion, simple and radical and deeply uncomfortable. Listen to the women. Listen to the women who have been harmed and believe them. Listen to the women who are taking the drugs now and take their fears seriously. Listen to the women who have been saying, for decades, that the system is rigged against them. Because the women were right. They were right when they said the pills were making them sick. They were right when they said the doctors weren't listening. They were right when they said the drug companies were lying. They were right when they said the regulators were failing. They were right about everything, and they were ignored, patronized, dismissed. The history of diet pills is a history of women being told that their lived experience is less credible than a pharmaceutical company's press release. It is a history of gaslighting on a massive scale. The reckoning, when it comes, will begin with listening. It will begin with acknowledging that the crisis of the 1970s was not an anomaly, but a pattern. It will begin with the recognition that Carol, Evelyn, Patricia, and millions of others were not unfortunates caught in an unavoidable tragedy, but victims of a foreseeable and preventable disaster. It will begin with the demand that the current generation of weight loss drugs be subjected to the most rigorous, independent, long-term safety monitoring ever conducted. And it will begin with the understanding that weight, health, and worth are not the same thing, and that a culture that convinces women to risk their lives for thinness is a culture in desperate need of transformation. The story of the 1,970th diet pills is not over because the patterns it established are still active, still claiming victims, still generating profits, still evading accountability. The women who died are gone, but the women who survived are still here, still speaking, still hoping that someone will finally hear them. Their testimony is in the court records, the medical journals, the self-published memoirs, the support group meetings that still convene in church basements and community centers. It is a vast, unorganized, partially suppressed archive of suffering and survival, and it is waiting to be opened. The final chapter of this story has not yet been written. It will be written by the choices we make now, as patients, as citizens, as a society. Will we demand that the FDA be fully funded and empowered to require rigorous long-term safety studies? Will we insist that direct-to-consumer advertising be banned, as it is in nearly every other developed country? Will we challenge the cultural obsession with thinness that creates the market for these drugs in the first place? Will we listen to the women who are trying to warn us, or will we wait until the next generation of bodies is counted? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the most urgent questions in American public health today. And the answers, whatever they turn out to be, will determine whether the cycle continues or is finally, definitively, broken. There is a photograph that Carol kept on her mantelpiece until the day she died. It shows a woman in her early 30s, smiling, wearing a floral dress that was fashionable in 1968. Her hair is neatly curled. Her makeup is modest. She looks, by all accounts, like a woman who has everything under control. The woman in the photograph is Carol. She was 29 years old and taking 5 amphetamine pills a day. She had not slept properly in 18 months. A few months after that picture was taken, she would experience her first full-blown panic attack while standing in the checkout line of a grocery store, her heart hammering so violently she thought she was dying. The photograph captures the precise moment before the collapse, the moment when the illusion was still intact. She kept it, she said, to remind herself that harm does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a white coat. Sometimes it comes in a small brown bottle. And sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we desperately want to believe. This documentary has traced the arc of a catastrophe that spans more than half a century. It began with a war that normalized stimulants, passed through a medical establishment that prescribed them as wellness, and settled into a culture that demanded women be thin at any cost. The names of the drugs changed: Dexedrine, Obetrol, Pondimin, Meridia, Belvic, Ozempic. The mechanisms differed: amphetamine, serotonin, GLP-1. But the underlying structure remained constant: a profit-driven industry, a captured regulatory system, a complicit medical profession, and a population of women whose bodies were treated as a perpetual problem to be solved by the next miracle pill. What makes this story so difficult to absorb is not its complexity, but its simplicity. There were no supervillains, no shadowy cabals operating in secret. The participants were ordinary people, doing their jobs, following incentives. The pharmaceutical executives believed they were meeting a market demand. The doctors believed they were helping their patients. The regulators believed they were balancing risks and benefits. The women believed they were taking control of their health. Everyone was acting rationally within a system that made the irrational inevitable. The harm was not the result of malice, but of a million small decisions, each one defensible in isolation, that collectively produced a public health disaster of staggering proportions. That is the most unsettling lesson of the diet pill era. It is not a story about evil people doing evil things. It is a story about good people trapped in a bad system, a system that rewarded short-term thinking, incentivized ignorance, and penalized the truth-tellers. The few doctors who raised early warnings about amphetamine addiction were marginalized, their careers damaged, their reputations smeared. The women who complained of side effects were dismissed as neurotic. The journalists who investigated the industry faced legal threats and advertising boycotts. The system defended itself with all the resources at its disposal, and those resources were vast. And yet, the system was not invincible. It cracked, eventually, under the accumulated weight of evidence and activism and sheer human suffering. The women who refused to be silent, the researchers who refused to look away, the lawyers who took on impossible cases, the journalists who published damning investigations, they forced the cracks wider. The 1971 scheduling change, the fen-phen recall, the billions in settlements, the incremental FDA reforms, all of these were victories, however partial. They proved that pressure, applied persistently and collectively, can move even the most entrenched institutions. But the story does not end with a celebration of progress, because the progress has been so painfully slow and so easily reversed. Each reform triggered a counter-reform. Each regulation created a loophole. Each successful lawsuit taught the industry how to structure the next one. The game is not rigged in the sense of a fixed outcome. It is rigged in the sense that the rules are written by the players, and the referees are paid by the team. Until the rules change, the outcomes will not change. And the rules will not change until the public demands it, with a clarity and a persistence that our fractured attention spans rarely sustain. In the meantime, women are still taking the pills. They are still trusting the white coats. They are still feeling their hearts flutter and their moods darken and their lives contract around the daily ritual of chemical management. They are still being told it is safe, it is effective, it is their choice. Some of them will be fine, most of them probably. But some will not. Some will develop the new equivalent of valvular heart disease or gastroparesis or a condition we have not yet named, and their suffering will be logged as an unfortunate side effect, an acceptable cost of progress. And the cycle will continue, because the structure that produces it has not been dismantled. So what do we do? The question is not academic. It is personal, because every person watching this documentary has a body, has a relationship with food and weight and health, has absorbed the cultural messages that equate thinness with worth. We are all swimming in the same water. The question is whether we stay passive, accepting the current as inevitable, or whether we start swimming against it, demanding cleaner water for ourselves and for those who come after us. The most radical act in a culture that profits from your insecurity is to refuse to be insecure. The most revolutionary demand you can make is for evidence, for transparency, for accountability. The most powerful thing you can do, if you have been harmed, is to speak your truth. And the most compassionate thing you can do, if someone tells you they have been harmed, is to believe them. Not to question, not to minimize, not to offer the platitude that the drug works for many people and they must be one of the unlucky ones. Just to believe them. Because the history of diet pills is a history of women not being believed. Breaking that cycle of disbelief is the first step toward breaking the cycle of harm. This is the part where I am supposed to tell you to like and subscribe, to ring the notification bell, to leave a comment down below. And I will ask you to do those things because this channel exists to bring forgotten histories into the light, and that mission depends on your support. But more than that, I want to ask you to do something harder. I want to ask you to carry this story with you beyond the screen, to talk about it with the women in your life, to ask whether your mother or your grandmother or your aunt ever took diet pills, and whether anyone ever asked them how they were really feeling. To look at the advertisements for weight loss drugs with the same skepticism you would bring to a used car salesman. To question, gently but persistently, the assumption that thinness is the measure of health and that risk is the price of beauty. The history of the 1970s diet pills is not a closed chapter. It is a living document, still being written in the bodies of millions of women around the world. The archive is not sealed, it is open, and you are standing in it. The question that animated this entire investigation, how did this happen, and will it happen again, is not one that a documentary can answer. It is a question that each of us must answer, again and again, with the choices we make about our own bodies, the trust we place in institutions, and the solidarity we extend to those who have been harmed. Thank you for staying with this story. It has been a long one and a heavy one, and if you have made it to the end, you have given it the respect it deserves. The women whose stories you have heard, Carol, Evelyn, Patricia, and the millions they represent, would be grateful, I think, that someone finally listened. The best way to honor them is not to mourn what they lost, but to fight for what they never received. A system that values their lives over its profits. A culture that sees their bodies as more than a number on a scale. A future in which no woman has to choose between being thin and being alive. If this documentary has meant something to you, please leave a comment, sharing your thoughts or your own experiences. These stories live in the shadows, and every time one is spoken aloud, the shadows recede a little. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into the histories we were never taught. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, send it to them. The truth, like the harm it describes, does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary day, and asks only to be heard. Thank you, and good night.